Today's video, we're going to take a look at what starts the downswing and maybe look at that question from a little different perspective. So what you're looking at here is a transition sequence, and we call it the athletic motion transition sequence, not because of our name, but because of all the sports that we've looked at. And we've studied a lot of different sports. It all pretty much moves the same way, in a lot of cases identical. So if you're punching, passing, kicking, throwing, whatever, you pretty much have an identical transition sequence for those sports as you do in the golf swing. So those are athletic motions. So we call this the athletic motion transition sequence. And it basically has 5 kind of checkpoints or 5 landmarks in that sequence. And we're going to talk about those today in this video, but we're going to talk about them in a little bit different perspective and show you some different windows on that. But to kind of get a perspective on it, let's look at the golf swing here, or this pro's golf swing at full speed, so we can get a sense for not only how fast the swing is or how little time it takes to make the golf swing, but then put some more perspective on how relatively short that window is for a transition sequence. So what happens first? In all the golf swings we've looked at, whether the golfer is a high rotational player, a low rotational player, whether he plays a fade, slice, straight ball, whatever the case may be, we see this transition sequence always start with sway. So the body sways away from the target. The body rotates away from the target. We call that the backswing. The body sways and rotates towards the target. We call that downswing. So anything moving away from the target is backswing. Anything moving towards the target is downswing. Now, everybody sways in the golf swing, regardless of intent or feel or whatever. There's sway in every golf swing, and that's where the transition starts. It starts, in this case, this professional golfer, his lower body sway starts forward right here. That's where his transition starts. Next, very shortly after, really indistinguishable by the images here, his upper body sways towards the target. So that's the second part of his transition. And you can call that slide, you can call that transition, translation, shift, slide, surf, whatever you want to call it. The body moves laterally, both away and towards the target, and that's what starts the transition. And then that has a little bit of motion. So the body is swayed first, both upper and lower bodies, as the rotation in the backswing is continuing. So those do not happen at the same time. You can sway, and good golfers do sway towards the target as they are completing the rotation away from the target. It's an important point to make. So we can see now he's continuing his rotation. Then he gets to this point right here. That's where his pelvis starts to change direction. Now his pelvis is starting the downswing right here. Very shortly after, his upper body changes direction. And then very last is his club head. Right there is the transition sequence. So pelvis sway first, torso sway second, pelvis rotation third, torso rotation fourth, and then the club head changing direction is the 5th element of this transition sequence. And again, it's something that we see regardless of shot shape, regardless of rotation amount, regardless of the sport you're playing. This is the transition sequence that we see all the time. With regards to timing, this transition sequence takes this golfer 0.1 second from start to completion. That's a very small window inside of that 1 second golf swing. So now let's take a look at a different golfer, another pro golfer, one of the best ball strikers out there. We're going to see a much wider range now of transition. So the first image is where his pelvis sway has started transition. So this golfer is actually starting his downswing, starting his transition with the club below parallel to the ground. We actually see this from a number of golfers. And the benefit of this is it gives you way more time to transition, so the transition can be much more gradual. Unlike our first golfer who had a 0.1 second window, this golfer has a much larger transition window than the first golfer. Then very shortly after that, still short of shaft parallel, we can see his torso sway started. Then a much bigger window of time between the torso sway and the pelvis rotation transitioning. And then the fourth image, obviously, is the torso rotation. Almost immediately, torso and pelvis transition at the same time with this golfer. Almost immediately. Like, I think it was 1 frame difference, and that slowed down this slow. So virtually identical. And then very soon after that, the club changed direction. So yeah, it's technically true that the lower body rotates first, then the upper body rotates, but practically speaking, they happen virtually at the same time. And if you have to zoom in, microscopically on like a kinematic sequence graph to see when these things happen, that's not practical useful or very useful as far as we're concerned. Looking at it from a time frame, from the overall golf swing, they happen at virtually the same time, and we see that in both golfers with 2 drastically different transition sequences. So yeah, technically the hips go first, but we like to think of it as the sway first, then the rotation, then the club. Trying to distinguish between when these 2 golfers rotated their pelvis and then their torso is just not very practical for us. And we see actually a lot of golfers get into trouble because of that. And we'll talk about that in our next video. But this is the transition sequence. It happens with sway, regardless of the golfer that we've seen, all the tour data that we have. The sway starts the transition, then the rotation, then the club. And that's pretty much across all sports that we've looked at. So by our estimation and by our data, the transition starts as early as club below waist parallel or shaft parallel, and as late as kind of up there beside the shoulder. And the rest of it happens very quickly, but it starts with a sway and finishes with the club.